Dear friends, today we have Professor Denis Rancourt from Canada. He sometimes allows people to pronounce his name differently, but his real name is Denis Rancourt. And he's a professor of physics, a retired professor of physics, and he will tell us about mortality, which is extremely important because that is the one tool that proves beyond any reasonable doubt, beyond any doubt whatsoever, if or if not the so-called vaccination campaign is responsible for what many people believe is a serious spike in excess mortality. Thank you very much for making the time, Denis. Welcome to our show. And please introduce yourself, because I've been reading up on you, but all I realize is that Wikipedia is not the best source of information. It tells us that you're a combative person because what does they say? You have been involved in confrontations with your former employer, the University of Ottawa. But that's only part of the story. That's part of the framing, I believe. So go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, don't get me started on Wikipedia and how the editors work and all of that kind of thing. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here with you. I'm glad to participate in this way and to bring the data that I've been working on for many years. I did my degrees in physics, so I did a BSc, an MSc, and a PhD in physics. The PhD is from the University of Toronto in Canada. I then went on to be Natural Sciences and Engineering Council of Canada International Postdoctoral Fellow, and I did those fellowships in France and in the Netherlands in prestigious laboratories. And I was also changing fields at the same time. I became quite interdisciplinary. I did my first postdoctoral fellowship in an actual synthetic chemistry laboratory. So I went from physics, including theoretical physics, to synthetic chemistry. So I was already starting to form myself as an interdisciplinary scientist. And then I became what they call an NSERC University Research Fellow, which was a national competition in Canada. At the University of Ottawa is where I had that candidacy. And then I also entered the tenure track, and I was a tenure track professor, and I was there for 23 years at the University of Ottawa, and I attained the highest academic rank of tenured full professor in physics, cross-appointed with earth sciences, doing interdisciplinary research. And I was the lead of a big research group, and we had all kinds of instruments in my laboratory, and we studied environmental problems and particles related to nanoparticles and so on. So I was doing all of that, and I did it for a long time. And now I am a co-director of a new nonprofit that we created, which is called Correlation Research in the Public Interest. And so that's what I've been doing most recently, and I've been very involved in the COVID period. I've written more than 30 articles and big reports about COVID-related matters since the start of this madness. So that's kind of in a nutshell where I'm from. And I think the best thing now is to show you my slides and to go through some of the data that I've gathered and so on.
I can't wait to see that. One of the people who suggested that we must talk to you is, of course, my friend Dr. Mike Yeadon. And he is one of the most authentic, one of the most knowledgeable scientists who have very early, from the start of the pandemic, spoken out. And if he says that we need to talk to you, then there's no doubt we must talk to you. So I can't wait to hear what you have to give, what kind of evidence you have, because ultimately this is what it'll be. It'll not just be informative for the people, which is really, really, really important in order to give them the opportunity to make the right choices, but it might very well become evidence in a court of law or in many courts of law.
Well, I have to say the feeling's mutual regarding Mike Yeadon. I mean, I would say we're friends, and he is absolutely brilliant, and his public statements at the very beginning very much impressed me. and opened me to wanting to know who this man is and what does he think and how did he come to think it and so on. So we've been interacting on key points and so on. So yeah, I appreciate that he has recommended that I be here.
Yeah.
Good, good. So I can share my screen now if you'd like.
Sure.
Let's see. I've hit this share screen button. Right one and share. I think I did it right.
Yes, it's coming up.
Good. All right, so I prepared this slide presentation. A lot of the slides are the same as what I just presented at the National Citizens Inquiry in Canada, where I give a lengthy presentation, and I gave it both in French and in English. So I gave it in French in Quebec City and in English in Ottawa. But I've added many slides to this presentation to specifically talk about New Zealand and the Maori, because I think you have an interest in that part of the world for various reasons. So
absolutely.
So here we are, and I'm now going to see if it will allow me. Fine for that, and then will it allow me to change the slides? Oh, it just took a little time. Okay, here we are. So the first thing is I want to reiterate some of my relevant expertise, because I've written over 100 articles in peer-reviewed science journals, but in many different areas. So I'm an expert in nanoparticles, environmental nanoparticles, their formation, how they react to things, how they move, their kinetics, and so on. I'm an expert in molecular science, meaning understanding how molecules react and how you can characterize them, and even their dynamics and so on. So both at the theoretical and the experimental level, I'm an expert in molecular science. I'm an expert in statistical analysis methods. I've written papers where I've used and developed advanced techniques such as Bayesian inference theory and so on. So I know all about, and I was teaching these methods and error propagation in complex systems and so on. I am an expert in theoretical modeling. I was modeling environmental processes, and recently now we're modeling using epidemiological accepted theory and showing what the consequences of believing those theories is by doing sophisticated modeling. So we have some papers that are at various stages of being accepted in peer-reviewed journals right now at the moment. And I'm also a scientist who knows everything about measurement. I say everything. I mean that I developed and taught a graduate course to all the different science departments in the Faculty of Science that were about how do you measure things in science. So the big categories, diffraction, spectroscopy, microscopy, bulk measurements. These are all areas that I've actually written scientific papers about and helped to develop. And I had an electron microscope in my own laboratory. I had many spectrometers. I was doing nuclear spectroscopy, optical spectroscopy, and so on. So I know how to measure things. I know what the errors involved are when you do scientific measurements. I know how to calculate all of that. I know how to do theoretical physics, theoretical modeling, theoretical science, but also very practical, down-to-earth laboratory and even field work environmentally and so on. So that's my background. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist. This work that I'm going to be presenting was done with very precious collaborators that are named here: Marine Baudin, Joseph Hickey-Jeremy, Mercier, John Johnson, who is a professor at Harvard University. We wrote a paper together about the effects of lockdowns in the United States. And recently, Christian Linard, a Canadian professor, has joined us. Marine Baudin helped me in a rush to prepare the slides for the Maori in New Zealand that I'll be showing later on. We have written more than 30 large reports and articles about COVID-related matters. They're on my website. They are quite detailed, and we've been doing it since early 2020. I prepared a book of exhibits for the National Citizens Inquiry, which would be the same basic documents that I would use in supporting all the work that I'll be telling you about today. So this book of exhibits is almost 900 pages, and it is the key articles and reports that I've been using to draw from to make this presentation. So I can give you, I think I may have already sent you that book of exhibits, and I can make that available as well. And the last exhibit in this series is one that is an article I wrote in 2019, article number 87 there, which is actually an analysis to try and understand geopolitics since the Second World War up to the time that I wrote it, which gives us, I think, a very important context for what happened during COVID. But that's just more of my being interdisciplinary. So here are the main conclusions that I have come to by studying all-cause mortality. There was no pandemic causing excess mortality. The measured excess mortality that can be identified is due to the response or the measures, the treatment protocols, the assaults against people. That is what caused mortality before the vaccines were rolled out. And then there is a definite mortality that is associated with the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines. So overall, I must say that I would have to conclude that if governments had not reacted, and if we had just done business as usual, treating people like we normally do, there's more death and illness in the winter in northern latitudes and so on, just doing the usual with the resources we had, there would have been no excess mortality during the entire COVID period if we had done nothing. That's my conclusion. This is now we're getting into the all-cause mortality. This is what all-cause mortality looks like. It's simple mortality. Any death, irrespective of the cause, is counted, and you can do this by units of time. So this is data by month that I'm showing you now, but it can be by week or even by day. And you record it as a function of time, and you notice that this is for the United States from 2000 to 2021, and you notice that there are ups and downs. The mortality is generally higher in the winter and comes down to a trough in the summer, and evolves slowly as the age structure of the population changes and so on. And what you see in this graph is the last bit of mortality there. The last regime is the period after the pandemic was announced on the 11th of March, 2020. So you see that there's generally a much higher mortality in that period. And the black dots are the summed up or integrated mortality for a period equal to that full COVID period. So from the time the pandemic was announced to essentially the present, when you add up all the mortality, you get that value. And in the previous period of the same duration, you get a much lower value. And then you get a gradual evolution of that integral over that window as you slide the window back like that. This is to show that there was a sudden increase in mortality during the COVID period in the United States, okay? And there are idiosyncrasies. For example, February has only 28 days, so there's always a dip in February. So you can spot the Februaries there in that data, for example, when you're doing it by month. This is what that same data for the United States looks like, but on a bi-week basis. And again, we've got that coloring for the COVID period, and we've got the integral value of the total mortality during the COVID period compared to the previous two periods of equal duration. You can see that stepwise increase in mortality for the United States. And what we found in the United States is we looked for that excess, we quantified that excess mortality and in the different peaks and at different times during the COVID period. And we found that the excess mortality of the COVID period on a by-state basis correlated very strongly, and that's a technical term, very strongly. The Pearson correlation coefficient here is plus 0.86, which is very strong correlation with the degree or the proportion of the population that is living in poverty in that state on a by-state basis. So you see this very strong correlation, and it's not just a correlation, it's a proportionality. The best line fit goes through the origin. So in other words, in a state, if no one was living in poverty, no one would have died. That's the kind of prediction you can make from this observed strong correlation, okay? And that correlation we saw for things like, we saw similar correlations for, how many people in the US population are living with a disability that makes them not functional in society. And one of the main disabilities is due to a serious mental illness. So there are 13 million certified people in the United States that are disabled because of a serious mental illness. So they are highly drugged and they are highly dependent on their caregivers and their environment. And when you transform their lives and take away all contact, all the usual contacts and routine from their caregivers, you can kill them. So there's a strong correlation between these disabilities and mortality on a bi-state basis as well. And that mortality is also much stronger on a by-state basis because some states have much more poverty and so on. So you really see the southern states light up in terms of excess mortality. This is the excess mortality for the 10 most populous states by age group in the United States in the COVID period before you start vaccinating. So this is what it looks like on a percentage basis. So this is the percentage increase of all-cause mortality relative to the historic baseline of all-cause mortality by age group. So you see that mortality can be easily 30% higher than normally, historically, you would have seen for all the age groups, basically across the board. So it is not at all characteristic of a viral respiratory disease. And supposedly COVID itself, also the death from COVID from clinical studies rises exponentially with age. So this is inconsistent with a viral respiratory disease and COVID in particular. And you can do the same data for after vaccination in the vaccination rollout period that was very rapid. And you get this kind of distribution of percentage increase of mortality by age group. So you see that the age structure has changed, and under the vaccination regime, you proportionately kill more of the younger adults, and younger people die than before. This is a graph for Canada, just to show how ridiculous their narrative is. In Canada, the chief medical officer for the country, Theresa Tam, with co-authors, wrote a scientific paper in which they claimed, based on models, that if they had not applied all the measures and done such a great job and vaccinated everyone, that there would have been approximately 1 million extra deaths in Canada. So I represented that in a simple model to show what 1 million extra deaths would look like on all-cause mortality in Canada, which you have in blue there. And so they are making the ridiculous claim that there would have been this extraordinary mortality like we've never seen historically. There's no world war that has produced this or anything in the historic record. And they are claiming that this is what would have happened if they had not been so good at their job and done everything they did. Whereas what really happened was, in Canada, nothing special. As you can see there, mortality just doesn't have a kink in it at the date at which the pandemic was announced. And so we pointed out that what they were saying had to be absurd, because if it was true, how is it that you brought the mortality exactly down to what it would be if there was no particular pathogen, or if nothing special had happened? How could you bring it back down to essentially exactly that same point? Not halfway down, not 10% higher than that point, but exactly, basically, not where nothing has happened. So, and it's not lower either. So we were pointing out that they're being very bold and and they're allowing themselves to say make absolutely ridiculous claims. So that we wrote a paper on that and how the Canadian chief health officers are just out to lunch completely. However, in Canada, you can look at that mortality in more detail, and you do see a slight increase. This is the mortality by cycle year, so from midsummer to midsummer. And as you go into the COVID period, you do see that the integrated mortality on a bicycle year basis is a little higher compared to an assumed linear historic trend like that. Okay, so there is a small effect, and it's noticeable in details. For example, young men in Alberta definitely had a higher death rate at the beginning of the pandemic, after they completely shut down the energy sector, put these people out of work, and made them very distraught. There was an increase in homicides and suicides, drug use, and so on. And a lot of these young men died. So you can see specific things like that occurred in specific jurisdictions. But overall, at the national level, this is what the integrated mortality looks like. This is what it looks like when you do it by, this was by calendar year, I believe. Let me see. Yeah, that one's by calendar year. This is by cycle year. And also, no, they're both by cycle year, but I'm sorry, I'm remembering my own slides. They're both by cycle year, but on a different Y scale. The previous one had Y at 0, and this is expanded so you can see it better. And then this is by calendar year for Canada. So you can see that the latest calendar year has an even higher mortality than during the initial COVID period year, and then during the year where they had mostly accomplished vaccination. And now in Canada, there's an even higher mortality compared to the historic trend. And so there are a number of countries like that have a higher mortality even in the year after most of the vaccine rollout has been accomplished. There are about 10 or 20 countries in the world that are like that, and Canada is one of them. And I'll show later that New Zealand is another example. This is directly comparing the all-cause mortality in Canada to the cumulative vaccine rollout, all doses. And so we discussed how some of these sudden and unusual peaks were directly associated with surges in the vaccine rollout. And then we analyzed that in some detail and pointed out various features. Just for curiosity's sake, D indicates a very sharp feature, which is a known heat wave that occurred over the course of some days in southern British Columbia and northern western states of the United States. And so there are features like that you can see in all-cause mortality. But we concentrated on the peaks that were certainly due to vaccine rollouts and the boosters and so on. Now, overall, if we come back to mortality at the beginning of the COVID period, one of the stunning features that we talked about right away is that as soon as they announced the pandemic in that period, there was in certain specific jurisdictions a huge surge in all-cause mortality. And you see that very sharp peak there that happens just after the pandemic was announced in specific areas in the United States. New York City was through the roof, and this is showing the states of Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York, where you see this huge peak. But it doesn't occur in the other places. 30 of the states didn't show a feature like this. So this is a very unusual feature that we believe, and it's the same feature can be seen in hotspots in Europe, for example, northern Italy, an area around Madrid, Paris, and so on. So, and it gives that same feature at the same time that's always synchronous with the announcement of the pandemic, when they started applying exploratory and very aggressive protocols in the hospitals. They basically, in the jurisdictions where they were doing that, they basically caused a surge in mortality.
The measures caused it.
Sorry?
The
Yes,
measures.
the treatment protocols, we believe.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to talk about that. So this is that initial peak, okay? Now, I'm going to show you a map of the magnitude of that peak, a map of Europe on a region basis of that peak. But this was a reminder for those who don't remember where the European countries are. And I put in blue here borders because I want you to notice those borders, because those are borders that the virus, because of its passport restriction, refused to cross. So the virus, which is supposedly is causing this death, had absolutely did not cross, for example, into Germany. Germany was not affected by this peak at the start of the COVID period. And what was happening in Spain did not cross into southern France, and so on. So these borders were just not being crossed by the virus. I'm being sarcastic. So here's a map of that excess mortality on a bi-month basis. We're going to move through the months, and we're going to go through that peak, which occurs in March and April. And you'll see the colors flare up in the places where it does. So right now, compared to the historic trend, there's nothing special happening in January. And then February, still nothing special. April is when it comes up. March. March is when it fires up. And this is where it has fired up. And you'll notice that there's no change in color for all of Germany, for example. You'll notice the border between Portugal and Spain. Northern Italy is a hard no pass there, as you can see. And then into April, the same regions are affected. It hasn't spread to anywhere. And then in May, it's gone. So it was a very definite peak that occurred just in those months and occurred in that way in those hotspots. And June is still gone, and so on. Okay, so there is no way that a viral respiratory pandemic can have this behavior, because these hotspot peaks were synchronous around the world. And there's a lot of, if you believe fundamental epidemiology, you have to admit that the time between seeding of the infection and the surge in mortality is extremely sensitive to the details and is highly variable and cannot be predicted months or even years, okay, within that time frame, because it depends on the society, how people connect with each other, how they contact each other, the degree of social contacts in the society, all kinds of things like that very sensitively affect when that peak in mortality will occur. So for it to be synchronous where it occurs around the world is strictly impossible from a theoretical epidemiological point of view. The other thing that's impossible is that it would refuse to cross borders between countries. Similarly, it refused to cross between the US and Canada. You saw that in the US was this huge mortality at that time, and in Canada, thousands of kilometers of border, two of the biggest trade partners in the world, exchanging all the time, nothing crossed it, virtually nothing crossed into Canada, even when you normalize by population. So here we have a virus that is sensitive to borders, if it's a virus. And so we asked ourselves, well, what was causing that flare-up? And we're in the process of researching this, but we have some candidates. For example, we believe that hydroxychloroquine, although it is a very effective agent that can be helpful, it is also something that if you give too large a dose, it rapidly becomes very toxic. So in places, not in Marseille, under the direction of Raoult, Didier Raoult, they knew what they were doing and they were very careful, and it was very controlled. But in many other jurisdictions, they prescribe very massive amounts, into the grams of amounts for sick people. And we believe that that is a candidate for the kind of fatal toxicity that the protocols have induced. So we identified HCQ as one of these candidates because the prescription rate has a peak at exactly the same place in those places where that peak occurred. Germany did not do this, and Germany has no excess mortality at that time. Another candidate is this clonazepam, which is a kind of a put you to sleep and ease you into your death kind of drug, which was massively used at that time as well. And there was also respirators, mechanical ventilators were being used. In northern Italy, they actually developed a kind of adjustment to their machines where they were able to put two patients on one mechanical respirator, and they were proud to be doing this, and they were extensively using it. And they told people, as soon as you feel sick, come into the hospital and we'll help you, we'll save you. And they were putting a lot of people on these mechanical respirators. So that huge peak of death in northern Italy was certainly, at least in part, related to that protocol, as was the case in New York. So we're identifying what did cause mortality, all-cause mortality, before the vaccines rolled out. Another thing that I didn't say is that in the USA, if we go back to the USA, where this kind of thing was happening, the deaths in the USA, when you see these kinds of numbers like this, as I said, correlates to poverty and so on. But what you have to understand also is that in the same poor states where a lot of these deaths occurred, most of the deaths occurred, they're also the states that normally in the winter have the highest prescription rates of antibiotics, 50% higher than usual, double what other states give, and so on. These are people that are very susceptible to bacterial lung infections, and they normally have a lot of antibiotics prescribed to them. And at the same time that the CDC is admitting in its own data that the people who so-called died with COVID also had a co-infection of bacterial pneumonia, that's admitted formally. At the same time, they stopped prescribing antibiotics. So the antibiotic prescription rate in the US and in all the Western countries dropped by 50% in the entire COVID period and was maintained. So mechanistically, one of the reasons that so many people died in the US, not only were they the fragile populations that you were assaulting in the ways that I explained when they had mental disabilities and so on, but also they were not being treated for bacterial. If they caught under those fragile states, under the effect of stress, if they got a bacterial infection, it was generally not being treated. So those are the kinds of mechanisms that give you these huge excess deaths in the COVID period before vaccination. And my next area of explanation in this presentation is to address the vaccines. And the first thing to say is that there can be little doubt that the vaccines cause a significant amount of death. There are many independent streams of hard evidence that show this. One of the most important ones is the autopsy studies. There are now many and more are coming out all the time, detailed autopsy studies that show this, the attack on the organs as a result of the vaccination. There's also
before you go into this,
yep,
Denis,
yep.
Can I quickly jump in and ask you a question?
Absolutely.
On one of the previous slides, you had the name of a good friend of ours, Dr. Klaus Köhnlein from Kiel in northern Germany. And we had interviewed him, and he told us that the problem with hydroxychloroquine was that it looks as though it was deliberately misused, overdosed, and that is based on some, I think if I remember correctly, British doctors confusing or pretending to confuse hydroxychloroquine with a drug that sounds almost like hydroxychloroquine but is different. And that in turn led to a lot of deaths in a trial in Brazil. I think 13 people died because the doses that they got were way too high. Can you confirm that?
His statements about this, and in particular how they relate to Germany, I think are very, very important. How I understand it is that Didier Raoult wrote a paper in the peer-reviewed scientific literature saying, look, from Petri dish studies, I see hydroxychloroquine effectively killing the virus, okay, as I see it in these experiments. And therefore, I think it's a good early treatment for COVID. That was his research, but it was not based on patients and actual people. It was based on tabletop science. And then, but that got a lot of people excited, and I think that encouraged a lot of emergency room clinicians to go ahead and use it. And especially if people were already really suffering from a respiratory ailment. And I think they were too exuberant in their use of high-dose hydroxychloroquine because it was happening in all these different hotspots. Like in the US, Trump actually, he didn't refer to Didier Raoult's work, but he actually said, this is the drug that's going to save us, you know. And in the US, it was approved for use much longer than in other places. And in the US, that peak of mortality lasted longer than in other places. Okay. So I see a big, what I think it's a systemic problem where they had the freedom to try things. They were encouraged to by the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and they went ahead and used high doses because this drug is known, and I'm just reporting what I read, but it's known to have a very well-defined therapeutic window, which means that if you step outside of it in terms of a higher dose, you kill the person. It becomes very toxic. And there are reports in the scientific literature where even young people were killed by doses that were lower than the kinds of doses they were using in treatments. Okay, so this is a very dangerous drug if you're not using it in a careful way and following what you're doing and so on. That threshold of toxicity varies with the individual, so it makes it really difficult, and with age. So it would have been easy if you're if you think that this is a solution and you're wanting to use it and the hospital environment allows you to go ahead and try this, I think you're going to be killing a lot of people in those places. So I think it's one of the candidates, in addition to mechanical ventilators and other candidates like these more sedative type drugs that were probably overgiven. So I can't confirm exactly the details that you were referring to, but I did hear his presentation about that, and it does make sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going through here and trying to convince you that there are independent lines of evidence that give a causal relationship between the vaccines and death. The autopsy studies are certainly one of the strongest ones. Adverse effect monitoring is really important and definitely shows a high peak of death immediately following vaccination. So there was a survey study that was done by Mark Whitmore that calculated based on what people were saying about people they knew, close relations that died following vaccination. He estimated 300,000 deaths from the vaccine in the US, and we get the same number in our estimate. Induced pathologies, there are more and more papers about that. There's more than 1,200 peer-reviewed articles about the harms of vaccines. So there can't be, people that report harms and studying harms, those are people that didn't die. So there has to be deaths in addition to that, right? And then there's the work that we're doing, which is what we call the vaccine dose fatality rate evaluations, quantification based on all-cause mortality. So those are the big lines of evidence. And this is an incomplete list of all the autopsy studies that are very detailed. And, these are forensic studies of what caused the death. And they generally conclude that the vaccine itself distributes in the body and attacks key organs that are essential and that cause you to die. And they show all kinds of micrographs of these organs and how they're attacked and how they're damaged and so on. And so we have to admit that the vaccines can cause death. And so we look for it in the all-cause mortality. And one of the first country that we looked at, I'm showing a slide for Australia, but the very first study that we wrote, I wrote a paper. I saw 4 papers come out about India, mortality in India. And all 4 of these authors, because India does not have fantastic national statistics on mortality that are easily accessible, okay? So when you're a researcher and you want to study that, you have to actually go into the various jurisdictions, the hospital systems, and so on, and gather the data yourself. So there were 4 groups of scientists who did field work and who gathered the best data they could. And they all 4 saw the same thing in different regions and using different methods, but they all saw the same thing. In India, there was absolutely no excess mortality compared to the historic trend until the vaccine was rolled out. And then there was a massive increase in mortality in India that we quantified to be 3.7 million deaths happened on the rapid rollout of the vaccine. And in India was very special because they actually explicitly recommended that you vaccinate people who had severe comorbidities. And they had a list of 12 comorbidities that they wanted you to go and vaccinate those people right away. And they called it, and the Prime Minister of India said, and we have to make sure that everyone you know and all the fragile and elderly people get vaccinated. So go out and vaccinate them. And he called it the Vaccine Festival. And they made sure that they vaccinated very rapidly these people with comorbidities and who were particularly fragile and elderly, because he wanted to mostly protect them. And they killed 3.7 million people, without a doubt in my mind. I wrote an entire paper about that. And I was fascinated when I saw the 4 articles to note that none of the 4 authors made a relationship to the vaccine rollout. They didn't see it. They didn't mention it. It's like it didn't exist. And I said, this is incredible. Yeah. So that was my first real contact with mortality from the vaccines, was in the case of India. Then we looked at all the data from around the world, and we looked for candidates like India, where there's absolutely nothing happening in terms of excess mortality until you roll out the vaccine. And Australia is a beautiful candidate of that type. Very good data, very clean. This is all-cause mortality from 1980 on. And you have a break and an entirely different regime of mortality as soon as you roll out in a military fashion these vaccines in Australia. So it was a good place to study what was happening with the vaccines. So this is, again, now that previous one was on a bi-month basis. This is Australia again, but by week. And you can see that heightened regime of mortality, and you compare it to the vaccine rollout, the cumulative doses that are being given, and you can see that the mortality normally has, in their summer baseline, you have to know that northern and southern hemisphere, the seasonal patterns are inverted. So people die in the winter of the place. So their winter is in our summer. And so the patterns are inverted. But once you deal with that in your mind, you can see that their summer baselines, which is in our winter, is all of a sudden higher in a new higher regime of mortality after you've started rolling out the vaccines. You can see that it's very sudden and nothing special until then. And you can see also in this graph, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but there is this peak here that is happening in their summer of mortality. So historically, nothing ever happens there. It's normally a trough in mortality, but all of a sudden you've got a peak, and that peak corresponds to the dose 3 rollout specifically. Okay. So for example, here's a comparison between that 3rd dose rollout in black and that peak in mortality for Australia. And the same thing happens in each of the states of Australia. You can do it. Here's Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and so on. You have this incredible synchronicity between the 3rd dose being rolled out and this onset of the mortality that immediately follows. You can see here for all of Australia. And so this is the kind of evidence that really convinces us that the vaccines are causing death in a large and measurable amount. And now I've gotten the data for New Zealand and the Maori in particular. And so this is the mortality by month for the Maori people in New Zealand. And in this case, you can see that there is a higher mortality at the end there, starting in about 2022. Do you see that? So you have a historic trend, which is, of course, it's noisy and everything, and there is that seasonal pattern. But then at the end here, you have a higher mortality. Okay. And this is in the Maori population, but it's also true for all of New Zealand. And this peak, and I've been looking at it, is there, this higher degree of mortality, and this peak is present for the older age groups. It's absent anyone 59 years old or younger. In those age groups, you don't see it. But as soon as you get into the 60 and older, that there is that all of a sudden new regime of high mortality. Okay, so that's what's happening in New Zealand. And now I can take this New Zealand data, but now use the by week instead of by month. So you get a higher resolution. You see the seasonal patterns. And now I can do this integration for the vaccination period. So I can say the vaccines rolled out. By the way, this is what the vaccine rollouts look like on a by day basis. So on the weekend, they vaccinate less. There are these little spikes and everything. And these are different doses. And you've got the fourth dose over there in purple. And so there's a definite vaccine rollout starting in 2021 and surging like that. And they start with the most vulnerable. So you can define the beginning of that vaccine rollout, and then you can integrate the mortality from the beginning of that rollout to the latest data that you have, and compare it to summed up mortality or integrated mortality for an integration window of equal length, so for equal duration, and back up in time like that. So you can see that you have a historic trend of that integrated mortality, and it's fitted with that brownish line. And then in the vaccine period, there's a higher integrated mortality. Okay. And that is for all ages in New Zealand. This is 80 plus years old. So it's very prominent there. And this is 60 to 79 years old. And then for the younger ages up to 59, there's nothing to be seen in terms of that maximum. This is the vaccine rollout, as I said, for New Zealand. And this is, again, showing the New Zealand data superposed with the weekly vaccine rollout. So you can see that heightened peak of mortality follows the main campaign of vaccine rollout and is coincident with that fourth dose coming in. And that's when you get that high peak at the end. So that's
but again, yeah. there's nothing in 2020.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
There's no excess mortality. It's consistent. I mean, it's even surprisingly lower.
Yeah.
But we would have to look historically if that year where you get a lower one is really significant. There are probably accidents like that happen. But there's nothing, certainly no excess mortality until you have this vaccine rollout. And you get into a new regime, and then you get the highest peak that you've seen in a long time. Yeah. Okay. So that's New Zealand. In the US, something very special happened in the southern states. This is Mississippi. What happened in the US is they noticed that they missed a lot of people following the initial rollout. And so they funded, the big financiers and the big NGOs and everything funded what they called vaccine equity. And what that meant is they hired thousands of people to go and vaccinate the people they hadn't yet targeted into care homes and everything. And they went all over the place and vaccinated these people. And so you can see a surge in the cumulative vaccine rollouts right here. That's vaccine equity. And it gives rise to a peak in mortality. This is for the 25 to 64-year-olds. It gives rise to a peak in mortality right there. In the middle of the summer in the US, when you never have a peak. Okay, so vaccine equity targeted, I think, disabled people in institutions and people like that, including young people, and created this massive peak, which we see systematically in all the poor states, that is directly related to an extra increase in injections due to vaccine equity. So that is, and in that vaccine equity, the death rate from the injections in that period when they were doing that is as high as it was in India for the entire population, which is about a 1% risk. So every 100 injection is fatal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's monstrous.
Yeah. That's how high it is. So it was very high in India. It's very high in these circumstances when you go and vaccinate extremely vulnerable people in poor states. Then you're getting a 1% death rate on a per injection basis. This is Michigan, where in Michigan you have a very unusual peak in the 25 to 64-year-olds that coincides with the initial rollout. And that peak is very unusual. And a similar peak associated with this rollout occurs in Ontario, for example, in Canada. So there are things like that you can see. Now, what we did, therefore, after we saw all these coincidences with vaccine rollouts, is we quantified the excess death divided by the number of injections given in that period, and defined what we call the vaccine dose fatality rate. So the risk of death on a per injection basis, okay? And it's expressed here on the y-axis as a percentage. And now we're able, in certain jurisdictions, we have good enough data that we can actually do that on a per age group basis. So we're discriminating age now. And there are two jurisdictions in particular where we can do that very well. And it's Australia and Israel, because they have such good data. And they're actually telling us how many people of which age they injected. And when we do that, we find that the risk of death, the vaccine dose fatality rate, increases exponentially with the age of the person that you're injecting, and goes up to, approaches the 1%, which we saw in India under those extraordinary circumstances in India for the most elderly, even in a Western modern nation like Australia or Israel. Okay, and so we find this very regular behavior of an exponential increase of this risk of death. So this is important because it's the contrary of what governments have been saying, which is you must go and vaccinate the elderly to protect them. This is the opposite of what you should do. The risk of injection of elderly people is orders of magnitude higher than it is for younger adults and so on. So you have to completely reevaluate your risk assessment before you start recommending this kind of craziness.
But you can only come to that conclusion, Denis, after you understand that these vaccines are dangerous. Because if they're dangerous, if you know they're dangerous, you're not going to go after those who are vulnerable already.
Well, they do know, clinicians and the establishment, they do know that it's dangerous to vaccinate very elderly and frail people. Mm-hmm. And so the most elderly and frail that are, expected to die within days or weeks or a month or so, generally do not get vaccinated. And that's why when you look at statistics of people who die, how many were vaccinated, how many were not, the data is very biased, because the people who are really the most frail, who are about to die, they don't dare vaccinate them, or they don't, the clinicians are not that obscene yet. And so the data gets very, very skewed. The data gets very skewed. Generally, more people die who are unvaccinated in many jurisdictions simply because you don't vaccinate the people who are on their deathbeds. Okay, and that's why that data is skewed, but that's right. That This is what the actual risk of dying from the injection looks like generally on a by age basis. And you can look at a blow up of that at the lower risks, and you can see that for young adults, you're above the exponential that you deduce for the older adults. So this, I believe, is related to the effect on the myocarditis among young athletes and so on. It keeps a high level that is age independent for young people. I'm interpreting now. This is what it looks like on a semi-log scale for the technical people who are used to looking at it that way, to see the degree to which it is truly exponential at older ages, and then deviates significantly from that in the younger ages. Mm-hmm. And those are realistic error bars that we did very carefully on that graph. And this is the final graphs are for Israel, what the all-cause mortality data directly compared to the vaccine rollouts looks like in terms of their coincidence for the first, second, third, and fourth doses in Israel, and by age group. So this is for all ages, and then you've got 80 plus year olds. And so what we're seeing is that the higher doses actually have a higher fatality rate. Okay, we're seeing that systematically. This is 70 to 79-year-olds and so on. And so we calculated that. We did the integrals, and we calculated the vaccine dose fatality rate as a function of age, as we now know how to do, but also on a by dose number basis. So which dose are we talking about? And we systematically see that the higher the dose, the greater the fatality rate is for that on a by injection basis. So there's always the age there, which is exponential, and we have a doubling time with age, which is always about 5 years. And in addition to that, if it's a higher dose, it's even a higher risk. Okay, so this is the first data of that type. We haven't yet published this report, but we're working on it. And this is the semi-log graph of that, and that this is my concluding slide. So in conclusion, regarding the vaccine, we see vaccine dose fatality rates around the world, everywhere where there was these rapid rollouts, that are always in the range of, for all ages, if you look at all ages in Western countries, typically 0.05%. More typical average sense for the whole world, it's about 0.1%. And then in places like India, it can be as high as 1%. And also for the more elderly in all countries, it can be as high as, for the higher doses, you're approaching 3%. So this is very, very systematic. So, every 33 injection, every 33rd injection will cause death, basically. That's kind of like what we're saying when you get into those numbers. So you've got a high risk of dying at that stage when you're elderly and you're getting one of the higher doses. And so based on these numbers, which are robust and that we see in many, many jurisdictions, you can estimate that worldwide, given the number of doses that have been given, it would have killed about 13 million people worldwide, would have been killed by the vaccine. In India, as we said, we quantified it to be 3.7 million. In the US, the number we get is 330,000 deaths directly associated with the vaccine, compared to overall deaths during the COVID period of 1.3 million in the US. So the measures, the lockdowns, all the horrible things they did caused a lot of deaths in a jurisdiction where you have huge pools of very vulnerable people. And in Canada, we estimate, we're still doing the error calculations and everything, but in Canada, it's between 10 and 30,000 people would have been killed by the injections. And that concludes my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Denis. This is sobering, to say the least. I just saw very recently, I saw a short video clip by Dr. Roger Hodkinson, who is a pathologist, but he is also, or was, a PCR test maker. He too, he's very outspoken. He came out right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we interviewed him, and he said right from the start that the PCR test, of course, is not suitable, and it's not authorized, but it's not suitable for the detection of infections either. But in this recent clip, he went even higher. So I assume that your numbers are conservative numbers, because he said if you can come to the conclusion that the vaccines caused 20 million deaths all over the world and more than 2-point-something billion serious adverse events.
Well, you know, the estimate that we do for the world, which is 13 million, you know, there's a large uncertainty on that because we don't have weighted high quality data for the whole world. We're just that's an estimate based on this robust risk factor that we're calculating. So you know, 13 million as a scientist, I can say 13 million is not that different from 20 million. Okay. But our number is not an underestimate. It's the best possible estimate that we can make given the data that we have. Okay. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of uncertainty on it. When you're trying to do it for the whole world, it's very difficult. When you can get data reliably for a country like India, and you can really see what happened, then our quantification of 3.7 million deaths, we're very sure of that, you see, for India. So that's the number for India. That's the contribution from India, for sure. You can go from there. So
it's roughly the same in Mississippi, as you said.
Yeah, the risk of dying per injection is the same as it was during the so-called vaccine equity rushed rollout campaign in the states in the United States that caused a peak in the summer when there's normally never a peak. That the fatality rate associated with that anomaly is the same as in India. It's about 1%, even for younger people.
I have a question. I read in the beginning of 2020 a report from a woman from Frankfurt, and she had been in Spain, had come back from Spain, and during preparing the evening meal, she described, and she was an author, so she could describe it very, very well what had happened to her.
Dagmar,
she felt
the connection is very bad. Dagmar, the connection is very bad. Can you phrase that question again now that we can hear you again? So that woman came back from Spain. She's an author. She was quite capable of describing what she experienced. What did she experience?
She fell suddenly sick shortly after coming back from Spain. And it was not a usual, you know, she felt it was something heavy, really serious. And she was sick for weeks and had a long recovery. And so my question is, because you said in Spain there was this extensive sicknesses, and she was treated in Germany, so it could not have been for her the treatment, because she didn't get the treatment that they received in Spain and in Italy.
Yes. Yeah. Well, if I understand correctly, this is at the beginning of the declared pandemic.
Yeah.
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 Well, you know, that
go ahead.
As follows. We tend to forget all the unusual things that happened with our health before COVID. I mean, influenza itself can be very severe and can take weeks to recover. Yeah. And, you know, I have memory myself of being very sick from various respiratory ailments, very, very sick. And people kind of, and it can make you dizzy. It can do all kinds of things, all kinds of unusual symptoms as well. We tend to forget that, that people are wearing COVID glasses because of the propaganda, including clinicians and MDs, and they tend to see everything in those terms. So that's one thing that I would say, which is very striking. Lots of examples of that. The other thing that I would say is that these hotspots, I've come to believe, are due to the treatment protocols, but some had ventured that maybe there was a release of a particularly, not something that spreads easily, but that is particularly virulent, to create hotspots in order to have a pretext. Some have said that. I don't actually see evidence of that, but a detailed study of what was actually happening and examples like those two possibilities. But there's so much evidence that it's just inconceivable for me that all these hotspots were due to intentional release of something or poisoning or something like that. There was some significant noise that possibly in Iran, where they had severe problems at the beginning, that there had been a bioweapon attack on Iran. There have been some proposals of that, but this is all very tenuous. I tend to look at national-wide statistics, and I try to propose hypotheses that make the most sense in terms of what we can establish. We know that they stopped prescribing antibiotics. We know that most of these people had bacterial lung infections, pneumonias. We know that, there's a lot of things that we know. So you don't need exotic explanations, I think.
And I think, Denis, and this is what others agree with me on, and with you, especially, for example, Dr. Mike Eden, but many others as well. The psychological aspect of what we're dealing with must not be underestimated. So if you see everything through COVID glasses, through the propaganda, then all of a sudden the things that you have experienced earlier, for example, a lot of people have suffered the loss of smell. Yes. During just regular because of a regular flu. The sense of smell was gone for a while, then it returned. The sense
Absolutely.
of taste was gone, and all of a sudden, when everyone tells you that this is especially special and typical for this very dangerous new disease, all of a sudden all your antennae light up, so to speak, and it appears in a much magnified
Absolutely.
sense. So that's why I think this has a lot. We must
no.
In
fact, they rely on that. This is why they're able to do what they do. They rely on that. They rely on our fear and our ability to, how our perception is transformed by the dangers that they are suggesting are out there. That immediately transforms our perception. Absolutely. I agree with that entirely.
Yeah, they always try to make themselves look as though they're omnipotent, even those people who they infiltrate into the resistance. That's the most important task that they have, to make things look far more dangerous than they are. In theory, yes. For example, if you look at microwave radiation, 3G, 4G, 5G, we did this interview with Barry Trower, who is just brilliant. It's there, but we don't know how far in practice they are really capable of abusing all of the tools that they have to kill us all. To a degree, yes, but I don't believe that. I do believe that 80% of what we're seeing is an illusion, a grand
Absolutely.
illusion. This is especially true for COVID.
Health, the ability of the human body to combat assaults, toxic assaults, is very, very high. So basically, if it doesn't kill you, you recover. And mortality is a very robust quantity. I see mortality throughout time in the US, for example, with really good data. I can see things like the Second World War, the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. I see the excess mortality there. I see excess mortality related to the Vietnam War. I can see heat waves in the summer. I can see all kinds of things, but I looked for all the pandemics that they have declared, and they've calculated how many deaths it creates in the United States. And since the Second World War, there have been several of these declared pandemics. None of them give a detectable excess mortality. None of them. Okay. So what are you talking about? What are all these articles? What are they about that calculate these hundreds of thousands of deaths and so on? I cannot detect it using robust data. Okay. So I've come to the conclusion that the only way to cause really large mortality effects in a society is to disrupt that society in a very significant way.
Yes.
So you have to have an economic meltdown or a major war, or you know, I can see an earthquake in Chile that in one day puts mortality through the roof of all ages because people are crushed in buildings. You can see things like that, but generally speaking, long-term excess mortality, increases of mortality, you have to have a societal disruption that is massive. And I have to conclude that that's exactly what the COVID period was, a massive societal assault against people. That is the only thing that can explain the nature of the mortality that I'm observing in all of its details that I've looked at. It's protocols, treatment protocols, refusing to treat, incredible stress, transforming people's lives, taking meaning away from their lives by removing their ability to socialize, their ability to work, including of the very vulnerable groups. All of these are huge transformations. I mean, there are peaks of mortality in the summer in the United States that we have never seen in the historic record. It's never happened before, ever. And it's due to the absolutely horrendous things that they did. And by the way, they only occur in the southern states where it's really hot and where there are a lot of poor people. And that generally have coping mechanisms that were taken away from them. So this was never done before to the society in this way, and it caused incredible effects that are not due to some pathogen. In my view, no pathogen can do this. Not, you know, that refuses to cross borders and attacks only the poor and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I conclude.
You know, everything I know from experts like you. And I can only agree with that. It is so obvious that everything went through the roof after the start of the vaccine rollout. And it is also obvious that the excess deaths, that the spikes in excess deaths in Italy and in New York are due to the panic mongering and the treatment protocols. We know now from Italy, for example, that 94% of the people who in Bergamo allegedly died of COVID died of completely other causes, and the same is true for New York. One question, I don't want to cut you off, Dagmar, but one question I still have is, did you look at the figures for children? Because you said they're not obscene enough to go after the moribund people, but they were obscene enough to go after the children. Is there anything special you found out about that age group?
Well, just the things that I showed you. I mean, there is mortality among young adults and children. I showed a graph in the US of the youngest age group. What was it, 0 to 10 years old or 0 to 9-year-old? And there's definitely an excess of mortality there. But that was even before they vaccinated. Okay. So in jurisdictions where you have very vulnerable groups and where you were causing excess mortality, it's from the start and including in the youngest people. Okay, I can show graphs, even in Canada. If you look at the young age groups, you can see basically there isn't even seasonality among young people. So it's a very flat line of mortality. And as soon as they announce the pandemic, there's a stepwise rise to a new level, and it's maintained. So there are many things that would have perturbed families, institutions, significantly affected children's lives. I don't know if it's related to depression, treatment, I don't know what it was, but there's definitely some increases in mortality. You can see these signals, and they're very reliable, but they're not the big causes of mortality in the whole population, right? Most of the people who die are elderly. That's just a given. But doesn't mean you can't have these very significant effects among young adults and children.
Dagmar, you wanted to ask another question.
I wrote it to Denis.
Oh, it's in the chat. Okay,
in the chat. Okay,
check it out.
I don't see anything.
Oh yeah, okay. The question is, would you go so far to say that it was deliberate mass murder? I would go so far as to talk about a mass homicide. I'm not sure I would call it a murder. Okay, so I would, my own interpretation is to think in terms of criminal negligence. There is definitely criminal negligence here among most of the players that actually administered these measures and the vaccines. There is criminal negligence, without a doubt. I mean, they are professional. A lot of them are professionally trained. They're supposed, they should know better. They have a duty to know better, and they should not have done this. So I would tend to go with criminal negligence.
I would distinguish between the puppets, all the people who they bribed or extorted, who actually administered the shots, for example, or the politicians who pushed for them, or the media people, and those who put everything in motion, what Catherine Austin Fitts calls Mr. Global. So if you look at the puppets, most of them are probably guilty of criminal negligence, but those who are pulling the strings behind the scenes, who have planned this for maybe decades, those people, in my view, shall be held accountable for mass murder, for genocide.
Another way to pose the question is, because it's equivalent to that, to what I'm going to tell you. Another way to pose the question is, when the elite leaders or influencers in a powerful state create conditions for a massive war that kills millions of people, is that murder?
I would say yes.
Okay, so this is a warlike situation. They wanted, it was a military operation, and they did this, and they chose to do it, and they planned to do it, and they executed it in the same way that you execute, you know, a war under false pretext against Iraq and kill 1 million people. Okay, it's that kind of thing. Now, I think these the people involved who did that are war criminals and should be held accountable on those grounds.
Yeah.
And so I think the right framework here is to think in terms of war criminals, because these were war measures. And they were against the domestic populations in order to create, well, now we're getting into why we think this happened and what the geopolitical context is and so on, which is outside of my all-cause mortality data. But I have certainly talked about this and given interviews about it. I mean, I have my own ideas about it, and I talked to Catherine as well in various Zoom meetings and groups and things. But that's beyond the all-cause mortality, you know.
Yeah, well, it depends on the individual who you are about to hold accountable. If we ever get a hold of those people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes, I'm absolutely certain that they will be held accountable for genocide ultimately. Crimes against humanity, it's so obvious. But of course, many of the minor players in this, most of the doctors, not all of them, but most of the doctors, most of the politicians, most of the media people, I guess the most you can get them for is criminal negligence. On the other hand, if you go into civil liability, if you go after them for damages, they will have to pay for this, all of them, because they're all not just, well, even if it's just negligence, it's enough. It's enough to hold them accountable.
Well, historically, the only time war criminals are held accountable is when they lose the war.
Mm-hmm. And they will.
Okay. And the war here is largely geopolitical.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that Russia, China, Eurasia, the competing bloc, is vicious and wants to annihilate the competitor. I don't think they think that way. They're not like that. So I don't think that these criminals will ever be held accountable, except maybe in public opinion. They may be shunned. There might be some rules of the game that are changed that are not as much to their favor, that, you know, where corruption might be removed to some degree. These kinds of things might happen. Some people might lose their fortunes, but I don't think they'll, just me, but I don't think that these people will ever be held accountable in the sense of a war tribunal, you know.
Well, we're gonna try and do our best to prove you wrong.
Well, I hope I'm wrong, and I think trying to do that is a very worthy task.
Well, and this is I can't thank you enough. This is the most concise, and this is the best presentation I've ever seen on all-cause mortality over the last 3 years. It is absolutely stunning. It is absolutely persuasive, and it's obviously going to hold up in any court of law once we get there to a court of law that will finally give us a fair hearing and look and listen to all our evidence. But I think we're on a good way. And as you said, even inside the system, the evidence is now so strong and compelling that there will be judges, even in Canada, even in the United States, who will not refuse to throw this out and call it a querulous complaint or something like that. So I can't thank you enough for this. This was very, very eye-opening. I actually didn't expect this.
Well,
Okay.
I've been writing about it for a long time, so I would encourage people to go ahead and dig into my website. You'll find a lot of material there.
Yeah, and the most important aspect to all of this is indeed the court of public opinion. It is definitely much more important to get the general public to understand what's going on than to get an individual court of law to look at it. That will do the cleanup work. But if we want to stop this, we need to get the attention of the people as a whole, and that's the court of public opinion.
I'm with you.
Okay.
I will do my part as much as I can.
You just did. Well, thank you very much, Denis. This was again, I have to say this is a dark subject, but it was a real pleasure to finally be able to understand what has happened.
It was my pleasure. Thanks
Thank
again
you very
for the
much then, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Okay.